Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Be My App webinar. We'll be starting in a bit. So once again, we'll be starting in a bit. So just make sure everybody's ready. Hi, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Be My App webinar. I'm Fernando, and it's awesome having you guys here again. In today's webinar, we're actually going to have Aaron Ladage, he's a UI developer, and he's going to be showing us on how to basically better up our front end, and he's going to be going with us the postprocessors. And without further ado, I'm going to let the man speak for himself. And before I quickly switch, I just want to remind everyone, if you were to have any questions, please do ask them in the comment section below. At the end, we always do check them out. And without further delay, Aaron, you have the screen.
All right, thank you, Fernando, and thank you everyone for coming. I will let you guys see my face here real quick. My name is Aaron Ladegi. My last name is a little unpronounceable, and I am a UI engineer for a company called DEG out of Kansas City, Missouri. Here's my contact info if anyone would like to look me up. As I mentioned, I'm with DEG out of Kansas City, and I need to take just a moment to thank them and recognize them for giving me the opportunity to speak here. DEG is located in Overland Park, Kansas, just on the south side of Kansas City. We are basically a full-service consultancy and agency, and we cover everything from web development to social media to email marketing to data management. Pretty much anything you can think of, we can handle. We got quite a bit of notoriety a few years ago, recognized as one of the 25 companies changing the world, and that was based largely on their model of entrepreneurship, this idea of kind of getting ahead or finding something that you can succeed with and running with it. And that's part of the reason that I'm here today. So want to thank them. As a Kansas Citian, I am contractually obligated to mention our fantastic barbecue and, of course, our beloved Royals. They may not be doing quite as well this year, but still got to give a good shout out for how they did last year. And I think about 800,000 of my closest friends would agree with me on that one. I am part of a team, UI team, that is very lucky in the fact that we get to, I always like to say, hyper specialize. Our UI work is separated a bit from CMS engineering, and we're able to really sort of hyper specialize and get really good at front end, the things that make front end, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I'm part of this lovely team right here. I always like to joke that I'm still working my way up to a color headshot, but hopefully I'll get that promotion one of these days. And we're not unlike any other UI team. We all kind of started out here, which is that we all fell in love with front-end development at some point, and hopefully for those of you out there listening can relate to that. But I think what happens if you spend any amount of time in front-end is you start to maybe not like it quite so much anymore. And I've been doing this for a little over 10 years now. I've been a developer for a little over a decade. And I still remember the first time that I wrote my first line of CSS. And it was something I'm sure very similar to this, which was, identify an element on the page by a class or an ID, and then do something as simple as color red. something as simple as applying a color. And I just remember the first time I reloaded the browser and saw, wow, that's really amazing. It worked. Just a simple little text declaration had such a simple, simplistic but powerful effect on the front end. But it didn't take very long to realize that maybe it wasn't as simple as it looked on paper or as I thought it was going to be. And for those of you who have been in this industry for a little while, you might recognize some of these. I wouldn't recommend them in practice today, but if you've had to support any older versions of browsers, you're probably familiar with things like the star and underscore hack to get certain things to work in older versions of browsers. And it gets a little more complex from there as we start looking at things like vendor prefixing and things like filters, where that simple little line of code turned into something much more monstrous pretty quickly. And then, of course, there's JavaScript. This is one of the oldest known, I guess you could call it, bugs in JavaScript. This will actually evaluate to true, and anybody who's been around JavaScript for a while has probably seen this, and they've actually acknowledged that it is sort of a shortcoming in the language, but they can't fix it because it would break web pages far and wide if they were ever to attempt it. Or even something as simple as, when you're interacting with the DOM in JavaScript, getting the scroll position of an element and getting that to work in a cross-browser situation is a lot of times not as simple as it really should be. And so I think with these languages, we think we're going to get these great things out of CSS and JavaScript. And then what we actually end up getting may not quite have the appeal that we thought it did. Got to slip at least one Pokemon Go reference in there, right? And I think historically that's kind of led to this view of front-end development as not a real sector of web development. And if you've been around it a while, you've probably heard these things. CSS is not an actual programming language, or JavaScript is a toy language. And you hear this a lot, particularly from people who have experience with more traditional programming languages or back-end programming languages a lot of times. And the thing about that assertion is they weren't really wrong. There really were a lot of shortcomings and are a lot of shortcomings in CSS and JavaScript. But I would like to make the contention that they're getting less and less right about that every single day. So I think in order to understand where those criticisms are coming from, we have to look at what's actually wrong with the languages. So let's take a look at CSS first. So what's wrong with that? What's actually wrong with CSS? The obvious one is cross-browser compatibility issues. For a language that is specifically designed to make web pages look pretty, it's maddening how frustrating it is to get things to work reliably and consistently across Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer, and Safari. And let's go to the other end of that spectrum, and that's the idea of vendor prefixes. And these, in a way, are a great thing. It's a way for the browser manufacturers to get out ahead of the W3C's CSS specs and start implementing things that are maybe ahead of spec. But the problem is, as a developer, it creates sort of this hodgepodge, this mesh of vendor prefixes and rules that we need to apply to our CSS in order to get them to work on these sort of future-facing features. I always bring this one up because if you think about it, think of another programming language, if you're going to call CSS a programming language, that doesn't have the concept of a variable. There aren't very many out there. The idea of inline importing. In general, just CSS out of the box, you really need to write things in one large file if you are hoping to have any sort of performance on the front end. And of course, you're probably listening and thinking, well, there's the @import statement, which has been around in CSS forever. And that's correct. That is a form of importing. However, if you're using @import at the top of a CSS file in production, you're basically lazy loading in another style sheet. In other words, you're causing an extra HTTP request and hurting the performance of your website. What CSS actually needs is some way of importing partials into one file before it is served out to your production environment. And then some little things like nested selectors. And one thing about CSS is, out of the box, it's very, very verbose. You're going to spend a lot of time repeating selectors and parents and those sorts of things. To kind of go with variables, the idea of a function. CSS is one of the few languages that doesn't have any sort of function built into it. No on-the-fly color manipulation. Now, obviously, you can set colors, and now, of course, you can use RGBA to do things like opacity, but there's not a great out-of-the-box solution for manipulating color on the fly, which, again, for a language that's specifically designed for design in the browser. It's sort of shocking. And this one has been improved with the calc calc property, but you can't even really do basic arithmetic. And again, if you're attempting to do a fairly complex layout with CSS, not having that ability is a challenge. So let's talk for a minute about JavaScript. Where has JavaScript had these claims of not being the greatest language for working in the web? I'm going to split this actually in two different directions. On the one hand, you have how JavaScript behaves in the browser and how it interacts with the DOM. But then JavaScript, of course, is its own standalone language that doesn't have to interact with the DOM in any way. So I'm going to try to identify issues across the board here. So problems with JavaScript in the browser. Historically, we've seen a lot of this. It's got a very messy, ugly syntax that a lot of people have trouble grasping. We have, just like on CSS, we have cross-browser compatibility issues. And this was particularly true in older versions of Internet Explorer. And in addition to just compatibility issues, not being able to use certain methods or functions in JavaScript, sometimes it's a performance issue too. JavaScript has typically been very slow or buggy in those browsers. Difficulty with DOM traversal. And for, again, a language that's designed to interact with the DOM, it's sort of shocking how difficult it is to go up and down your markup hierarchy. I'll come back to this in a bit as sort of a non-issue in modern times, but it is a bit difficult and has historically been difficult to do things like effects and animation in JavaScript. There wasn't a great, easy solution until fairly recently. So then let's talk about the language itself. The big one that I see is modularity, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of inline importing in CSS. There's not a great way to write your JavaScript in small, modular, single-purpose blocks of code, and then have those either concatenated or bundled together, or at least properly loaded in a module format without some sort of third-party tool to pull it off. And then I want to get into what I would say is a lot of syntactic sugar, but I don't want to dismiss syntactic sugar, because even though some of it is just for the prettiness of your code, a lot of this is very, very useful and has historically been very lacking in JavaScript. A big one is interpolation or template strings, the ability to write markup or write content that you're going to spit out, for example, into the DOM without concatenating together strings with your actual JavaScript. This has led in the browser to using a lot of third-party libraries like Mustache in order to write our markup as markup, but actually work with it in JavaScript. And then again, quite a bit of syntactic sugar here, but things like fat arrow functions, streamlining how we're writing our JavaScript. Default function arguments, having to, inside of our functions, write some basically checks on our function parameters to see what the defaults are, setting defaults there. Class-based inheritance I bring up. I'll talk about this with ES6 JavaScript, but has historically not had a class-based inheritance system. I would argue that JavaScript doesn't even necessarily need this. I'm not a class-based expert by any means, but it historically has lacked this. Things like constants, and I would argue that variable scope is a little tricky for beginners to understand. And destructuring. So we've had these limitations, we've had these shortcomings in the languages themselves, but developers are a pretty crafty group. And when they find a shortcoming, they usually find a way around it. And they've been filling in these gaps on CSS and JavaScript for as long as CSS and JavaScript have been languages on the web. And in general, the solution to this became preprocessors. And preprocessors have actually been a pretty good solution to this problem. If you were working on the CSS side, you're probably familiar with preprocessors like Sass or Less, or to some extent Stylus. And on the JavaScript side, I always joke that this is probably my slide that's gonna piss the most people off. You have preprocessors like CoffeeScript, and then I certainly do not mean to conflate CoffeeScript and jQuery. I know some CoffeeScripters who probably would not appreciate that being compared to a jQuery developer. But jQuery, of course, is not a preprocessor, but it is a runtime library that gives us some of the benefits of a preprocessor in terms of writing simpler, cleaner code. And that's really the only comparison I'm making there. So what does a typical preprocessor workflow look like? I think it's important to understand that. So you're usually starting out writing your code in whatever that preprocessor's proprietary syntax is. And I think that's important to note. If you're working in Sass, you are writing Sass code. And some of it may resemble CSS, but that syntax, especially when you get into things like mix-ins and variables, is very much syntax related to Sass. It is not CSS. You're going to have some sort of task running process in the middle. My team uses Grunt, but whether you're on Grunt or Gulp or Broccoli or anything of that sort for your build process, you're generally listening for changes to your Sass code. And then that code is compiled at before runtime, so at development time, and standards-based CSS is what's spit out on the other end. And that's the code that's actually fed to the browser. So your Sass code that you're writing in the beginning is never going to be exposed to the browser, and I would like to think that is probably never going to be natively readable by the browser. So in code, let's say we have a row here, for example. I've got an element, and I've got two properties. One is the @include display flex property, and then I'm setting a background color of $color blue. And that first property, for anybody who's worked in Sass, is actually a compass mix-in that lets us use Flexbox. And all we have to do is remember to use that @include display flex. Again, that's proprietary syntax. That is not the W3C's spec for writing Flexbox, but that's how you do it in Sass. Or in Compass, I should say. And then background color blue, the $ in Sass is a variable. So we're assigning a blue color to color blue, and then we can reuse that variable through our code. So just the basic concept of variables there. So what's actually output then, once our task runner is listening to this and compiles that code into CSS, is you'll see those first 4 lines are vendor prefixed. So the @include actually processes out into the properly vendor prefixed display flex property. So you'll see the 3 prefixes there, and then the official spec version last, which is the proper way to write that. And then background color is converted to the hex value that my variable is set to. And I'm going to pop into a couple of CodePen examples here. For anyone who's not familiar, codepen.io is the site, and I will share my slides afterwards here. So if anybody has any would like to take a look at any of this, feel free. These are going to be pretty simplistic examples, but I just wanted to show you some of the things you can do in CodePen and how you would write these in using Sass and Compass. So exactly what I said before. We're importing Compass first of all. We need to include that library. CodePen does it like that. You can actually set it up here so that your preprocessor is SCSS. And I have added in Compass. I'm not going to add it now because you can see it's already there. But you'll see then I'm able to use Sass and Compass within CodePen. So I've assigned a color white variable, a color blue variable, and then I'm using those right here. And then I do have my 2 @include statements here, one for display flex and one for justify content. This is a completely unnecessary use of Flexbox, but just wanted to show some examples of how you can do that. So we'll get into a few more sort of light coding examples here in a bit. On the CoffeeScript side, on JavaScript, I was never a CoffeeScript developer, so I should say that up front, but it does give you some nice conveniences. You'll see the for in syntax there for iterating through an array, and there's a spread operator there. You also notice syntactically you're able to do a lot of things that you can't do in raw JavaScript. For example, there's way fewer brackets, indentation matters, and you'll also notice there where we're console logging, within the quotation mark, we actually are passing in that $ and then num inside the curly brackets. And so that's my example there of interpolation or using template strings in your JavaScript. And so in CoffeeScript, we were able to do this. But what this is going to compile out to in our build process is something like this, which is basically a pretty standard for loop. And you'll notice the spread operator is gone, our brackets are in place. And then if you look at those console log statements, we're actually concatenating together strings with variables using the plus signs and quotation marks. So on the CoffeeScript side, much cleaner syntax there. I want to talk just briefly about jQuery. Again, it's not a preprocessor, of course, but it does give us a lot of conveniences, and it has a lot of historical need in JavaScript. It was definitely something that is particularly in older browsers that lacked great JavaScript support. It got us away from doing things like this, which is document get element by ID. And you'll see I'm not using document.querySelector or querySelector all because a lot of those properties were not supported in early versions of browsers. They're one of the things that was missing from older versions of IE and other browsers. So we had to do things like document get element by ID, a lot more limiting. And it led us in the direction of jQuery. jQuery gave us this very CSS-like syntax, much cleaner syntax. And a lot of people really fell in love with the flexibility that it gave them and the cleaner code that it gave them, not to mention better browser support. So everything was a lot better cross-browser tested and supported. But I think preprocessors really perpetuate a problem. And yes, I have practiced saying that out loud several times. That's a tongue twister. We're putting more and more layers of abstraction between the code that we're writing as developers and the code that the browser can actually read. And I want to give some examples of why I think this is an issue. So preprocessors are their own programming languages. Again, they have that proprietary syntax that you have to write in. A lot of times the preprocessors themselves are written in non-web languages. And for anybody who's listening and say, well, Ruby is a web language, technically, yes, of course it is. What I'm really saying is it's not a front-end language. So it's a processing tool for people who know JavaScript, typically. But it's written in a language that they don't necessarily know or understand. It tends to take a very all or nothing approach. Yes, there are add-ons like Compass and Bourbon, but in general, Sass tends to give you everything out of the box, whether you actually need to use it or not. Not as easily extensible. Again, this comes back to the non-web language thing. It's not as easy for somebody to just dive in and write a plugin for Sass as it is with something I'm going to show here in a little bit. And it must be compiled today and forever. And again, you're writing in this proprietary syntax, so it's highly unlikely that the browsers are ever going to support Sass or less out of the box. The browsers are not ever just going to be able to read that. And the browsers are catching up. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. Preprocessors have been around for a long time. They've solved a lot of historical problems. But I do think it's important to ask whether those problems are still as big of issues as they used to be. And we're going to be compiling our preprocessed code forever. So it's important to think about compile times. And if anybody's worked on a fairly sizable Sass project, particularly the Ruby version of Sass, not the newer libsass version, which has some performance enhancements, compile times can get really, really slow. There's a tweet from a gentleman named Ben Frayne that I really found interesting. He said, I'm estimating I'm losing about 16 minutes of productivity a day to my Sass compiles. And that might seem crazy until you start thinking, okay, every time I hit save on a file, that takes approximately 5 seconds. I might hit save on a file and go check it in a browser on estimate 200 times a day. So, 5 seconds times 200 divided by 60 is 16 minutes a day. So he's saying, obviously, Sass boosts productivity, but compile time can suck. So I won't completely rip on jQuery here, but I do want to just mention it real quickly. jQuery is a tool for developers and not users. And I've made this statement when I've given this presentation before, and I usually ask people if they can tell me or identify what benefit jQuery gives to their end users. In other words, tell me something that jQuery is giving a benefit to the people visiting your site. And I haven't had a lot of great answers on that. And that's, I think, because it definitely gives us a lot of enhancements as developers. It does help us with cross-browser compatibility and making sure that those things are working well. But a lot of that stuff can be solved without jQuery. And so we're putting this additional burden of loading this library and framework onto our end users, really for our convenience as developers. DOM traversal, something I complained about with JavaScript in the beginning. It really isn't that hard anymore with vanilla.js. And if you check out my slides, I'll take you out to a site called youmightnotneedjQuery.com. Some of you may have seen this before, but this is an excellent resource for making the jump from jQuery to vanilla JavaScript if you're so inclined. You can actually set which version of IE you still need to support. on your project. You'll see some codes changing down below there. And then it will actually give you on the left column the jQuery code and then the vanilla JavaScript equivalent on the right. And I think the thing you'll notice on some of these, it obviously looks longer because we're getting into things like effects. But if we're doing fairly some simple things or short things here, the code is a fairly equivalent length in terms of how to work with vanilla JavaScript. So that's a great resource if you have a chance to check that out. The browsers are getting better. And if we're talking about IE10 Plus and Edge, obviously, I'm not going to say they're perfect on the JavaScript side. That's very, very not true. But they have eliminated a lot of the cross-browser compatibility issues that we were using jQuery for in the first place. I mentioned transitions and animations in the beginning. We obviously have things like Canvas and WebGL now at our disposal if we need to do things with more advanced JavaScript and animations. But really, CSS3 is better suited. It is hardware accelerated and performs a lot better than JavaScript if you're going to be doing a lot of heavy-duty transitions and animations anyway. Dependencies suck. It's not much fun to make sure you get jQuery properly loaded and loading in the right order, particularly if you're working maybe in a CMS that's preloading, maybe a version of jQuery that you're not comfortable with. There's a lot of different situations where, if you've ever seen the $ is not defined error in your console, you're familiar with the problem with jQuery as a dependency. Performance matters, especially in the age of responsive design. And if you're loading in additional libraries that you don't necessarily need to force onto your users, that is guaranteed to hurt performance to a certain extent. And of course, you get to impress your friends with your library-less street cred. You get to be hipster dev, which is always arguably fun. And I also think it raises an important question, which is this concept of libraries versus languages. And I'd like you just to think, for those of you that have been around a lot or have any sort of mentoring role with junior developers or devs coming to your company, what are we learning? And what are we learning? Can't talk today. What are we teaching them? What are new developers learning? Are we teaching them the fundamental languages that they need to know, or are we just teaching them a bunch of libraries? Do they know Sass and jQuery, or do they know CSS and JavaScript? And I think that's an important question. So we've talked about some of the issues with preprocessors. There's got to be a better thing out there, and I just want to give a shout out to these as seen on TV actors. I think that they're a special kind of actor that we don't see every day.
Aaron, I must say you're on a roll with these memes.
I loaded them up. It's kind of early in the morning here, so I had to slip in as many things to keep things interesting as possible.
Man, keep on going.
So I hopefully have made the argument that preprocessors have their issues. So let's talk about postprocessors, why we're all here today, hopefully. And anytime I have this discussion, inevitably somebody will say, well, isn't a postprocessor still really just a preprocessor? And the answer to that is, yeah, you're right. It absolutely is. But it's also sort of missing the point. And I've tried to sum this up as it's not about when you're processing your code, it's about what your code is that you're actually processing. And if you're talking about this on the JavaScript side of things, really transpiler is the more accurate term, and I sort of wish that would be adopted on the CSS side a little more too. They tend to still say postprocessor, but really transpiler I think is the more accurate term. If you're working in post-processing on the CSS side of things, you're probably starting to hear about plugins and tools like PostCSS. That seems to be the big name out there. And if you're working on the JavaScript side, you are probably familiar with a tool called Babel. It used to be called 6to5, but they changed their name because they're trying to look out beyond just ES6 JavaScript. And the product on the right, despite the icon, is not an Adobe product. It's a tool called Tracer. And I believe that is actually created by Google. On the JavaScript side, I think you tend to see more people using Babel, but Tracer is out there. So just to reiterate our old preprocessor process, we wrote in our proprietary Sass language. We transpiled it. We preprocessed it with our task runner, and it spits out CSS like this. So what does a post-processor process look like? Well, the thing you'll notice is it's not drastically different except for this first step. And that is we're doing away with that proprietary syntax of Sass. We're writing our code in CSS. And so we're following the W3C spec, and we might even be following future spec, and I'll hit more on that in just a second. Our task runner, which we may still keep grunt or gulp in the mix, as well as PostCSS or Babel, whatever our tool happens to be, if we're talking CSS or JavaScript, notices our code change, and it still outputs that CSS and JavaScript that the browser can actually read. The difference, again, is step one, which is that we're no longer writing in the syntax. We're just writing display flex. And we're writing background color, and then we're saying var dash dash color blue. And I will talk about my hatred for that syntax in just a moment here, but that is proposed W3C spec for variables. And the code it outputs is the same thing we got out of our preprocessors. But the big difference is here that we're writing much simpler, cleaner, standards-based code, or at least proposed standards-based. So some advantages of PostCSS. You write CSS in CSS. That shouldn't be something I even have to say out loud, but it's true. You can use CSS3 with reckless abandon. You don't have to worry as much about vendor prefixing. If you want to use CSS4, which is not an actual thing, that link there will actually take you out to a PostCSS plugin called PostCSS. Oops, I've forgotten the name of this. CSS Next, sorry. And this is a plugin that's entirely dedicated to using next-gen proposed CSS standards. It works with your existing task runners. You don't have to remove grunt or gulp or whatever you're using out of your process. It is built on Node. So we're talking about a framework that is entirely built in JavaScript. That means no more bundle files, no more bundle, no more gem files, no more Ruby dependencies if you don't want them. I think that makes this easier to debug because you're working in NPM and JavaScript and Node. And you can write your own plugins, and there are tons of them out there using nothing but JavaScript. Arguably, it's much faster in terms of compile times. I say allegedly here because a lot of these stats are actually coming from the creator of PostCSS, and while I don't want to say he's not accurate, take it with a little grain of salt there. He says that PostCSS compiles 40 times faster than Ruby and 4 times faster than libsass. I can't back up those stats, but I would say it is noticeably faster than my Ruby Sass experience in the past. And there's countless plugins. And I want to talk on that just a minute. Unlike Sass, PostCSS is written very modularly. I like to think of Sass as the all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet, whereas PostCSS, and I made this slide before Chipotle ran into a lot of their health scare problems, but I think PostCSS is a lot more modular. It lets you kind of make your own choices and just choose the options that are right for you. And yeah, you can probably still get everything at Chipotle, but I wouldn't recommend that. So let's say you're intrigued by this. How do you get started? And the fact of the matter is you maybe already have. My team actually started down this path using a plugin called AUTOPREFIXER. And AUTOPREFIXER is interesting because it can actually function as a standalone tool, or it can actually be used as a PostCSS plugin. We were using Sass for our mix-ins and our vendor prefixing. And then we noticed this tool called AUTOPREFIXER. So it is a popular replacement for Compass. It automatically adds those CSS3 vendor prefixes for you, which I showed. You define your browser support yourself. So it's not based on whatever version of Compass or Sass you're using. It's defined in a config file. And then that also cross-references a caniuse.com database to determine what vendor prefixes are actually needed for the browsers that you config. No more memorizing special function names. There's no @include. You just write display flex, for example, and Flexbox magically starts working. I am going to, this is my old example here, and I want to show you in CodePen how you can swap this out pretty simply. CodePen does have PostCSS processing built into it. Because it's modular, you do need to add in the stuff that you want to use. I'm going to add in, oops, actually I don't want to use that. I'm going to add in nested, and actually I just realized they don't have the one plugin here that I need to show. So I may shorten this demo just a little bit. If you can pretend with me, in real JavaScript, or I'm sorry, in real PostCSS, you would not have to use these @use, but this is how CodePen does it. Clean this up here just a little bit. I can't do it quite. I think I'm actually going to skip my code demo here, but I'll change the display properties real quick. Display flex would look like this, and instead of saying @include justify content, I would just say justify content center. So in those examples, I'm just writing native flexbox, and it will just start working. Although it's not working for me at the moment. I'm gonna skip my very simple code example there. So again, AUTOPREFIXER is part of a much larger PostCSS ecosystem. There are, as you saw in the code pen list, they only have a fraction of what's out there. If you go out to postcss.parts, there's actually a complete list of all of the PostCSS plugins that are out there, and there are many, many, many of them in lots of different categories, as you can see here. I want to talk through just a couple that my team uses. If you're familiar with the concept of partials or globbing, again, being able to write in these simple little files, you can do that with PostCSS. And we use a plugin called PostCSS import for our partials. The concept of globbing, in other words, just sort of watching a set of directories and having your files concatenate together. There's a plugin called Grunt Sass globbing that we were using back in our Sass days, and we're still using it today. It works just fine with PostCSS. Nesting. This is a little controversial, particularly I tend to write these concatenation rules that actually add list wrap onto primary nav in this example here. But writing these nested selectors so you don't have to write primary nav over and over and over again is completely possible with a plugin called PostCSS Nested. There's another one called PostCSS Nesting that follows a W3C proposal. We have not made that jump yet, but it is out there. There is that proposed standard. It's still an editor's draft. That's one reason we haven't made the switch quite yet, is because the standard is just not quite there yet. Again, just like Sass, just because you can do something doesn't mean you necessarily should do that. So keep that in mind if you're doing a lot of nesting. I'm going to go through these plugins kind of quickly here because I'm running a little behind on time. Variables, again, the simple little idea of setting something once and then being able to reuse it over and over again. There's a plugin out there called PostCSS Custom Properties, and it's a really good opportunity to start using what I think is one of the ugliest syntaxes I've ever seen, but it is the W3C's way of doing things. The way you do this is you declare, for right now you can only do this on root, but you declare a root variable. In this case I set color blue with that dash dash, and then when I want to use it on an element, I just say background color and I say var and then dash dash variable name. So it's a little ugly. The good news is that this is going to be the standard, and at some point it's going to let us do something really powerful, which is not scoping to root, but actually scoping to individual components. And that's going to give us a lot of additional power in CSS and flexibility. So that day is coming soon, but it's not quite supported yet. Custom properties are already supported natively in Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. So this is a good example of a PostCSS tool that might someday be able to be eliminated from our workflow. It'll just work. If you're in a Sass environment and you just are loaded up with a ton of $ variables and you don't want to go through and rewrite your code, there's a plugin. I noticed it was actually out on CodePen called PostCSS Simple Vars that lets you keep the $ style variable. So that option's still there. Color, again, we haven't been able to do a lot on the fly with color with CSS before, but those days are coming, and there is a color module spec that actually has shifted a little bit pretty recently, but I'm still going to make the recommendation that we do kind of what I'm showing here, although the spec might shift just slightly. The proposed color spec is going to let us work in all kinds of new syntaxes, and you can do this with a PostCSS plugin. The one I would recommend is called PostCSS Color. And here's some things you can do with it. So we can say element color, and then there's our hex value. And then we could take this color function, you'll see it right here, and we pass a hex value into it, and then we use tint. If you're familiar with lighten and darken in Sass, tint and shade are going to be your equivalents. So you'll see this is a 40% tinting of this root hex value. Again, shade will darken that up 40%. And then we can start combining these things. So we can take our variables, and so we can assign them to color blue, and we can start making palettes. So we can take color blue as a variable, and then we can pass that in as a new variable into a new variable called color blue light or color blue dark, and actually set up entire palettes. And of course, then we can start mapping variables to variables where we're saying things like color text or color text light, and that's mapped to color blue, and color then color text light is color text tinted and color text darkened. And where this starts to get really cool is if your boss comes to you and says, "Look, used to love the blue color scheme, but now I want orange." I'm oversimplifying, obviously, here, but that's as simple as changing one variable. So suddenly we just change it to color orange, and our site and our styles and our color palette can cascade down and change on the fly. Again, this is all pre-processed or post-processed at the moment, but once the spec is actually established, this is the kind of thing that can be changed on the fly. Mix-ins. I'll be honest, I think Sass does this a little bit better. We do use a plugin called PostCSS Mix-ins, and there's another one called PostCSS Calc that'll do some simple arithmetic for you if that's all you need. But I would make the argument that if you're using a lot of mix-ins, you might want to take a look at whether your workflow is actually more complicated than it needs to be. And if you've ever walked into somebody else's project where they've used an extensive amount of mix-ins, you probably know what I'm talking about there. And it's this idea that someday we might actually be able to turn off our transpilers and our next-gen code could just work. Variables is a really good example of that. Let's not kid ourselves, though. I think there's always going to be a need for a processor. I'm not in any way trying to argue that processors or transpilers will ever be completely cut out, because I think there's always going to be a spec that we're hoping will be available in all the browsers. And there's always going to be something that we want to do that's just not quite there yet. So there's always going to be a need for transpilers. But what I like about these modular approaches is you can kind of pick and choose what you need and what you need now, and then change that up pretty easily. So I'm going to talk real quickly about JavaScript, and I am pushing a little bit on time here, so I'm going to have to rush this just a little bit to have time for Q&A if anybody has questions. But I want to talk JavaScript real quick. If you haven't heard, ES6 has been approved. ECMAScript International, ECMA International, the organization that sets the standard for JavaScript, has ratified ES6, the latest version of JavaScript. But of course, it's not fully implemented in all browsers yet. And we, of course, always have to support older browsers. But I wanted to bring up this list, a lot of this, again, being syntactic sugar. But we do have these things that we always wanted in JavaScript. ES6 fixes a lot of that, and we can already write it today using these tools like Babel. We can write our code like this. So that top line is basically ES6 module format. So we can just say import this module from this location, and then we can do things like constants. Variables that don't change state, they're basically immutable. We can use let, which is a new block level scoping of variables. And we can do this particular one, which I really like, this template string down here. You'll see I have these backticks, and I'm saying this is amazing, it's a multi-line string. I'm just hitting enter there, I don't have to do any concatenation. And our default text is, and then I'm pulling in this constant, and you'll see I'm doing that with this $ curly brackets, which is similar to the CoffeeScript #. But I'm able to pull it in like that. And then maybe I need this module to be available to other modules, so I can actually export it with the ES6 module format for exporting. So that's export default. And then I'm just exporting my function name there. And Babel's going to transpile this, it doesn't quite fit in my screen, to this. And a few things, I'm not going to dig entirely through this, but one thing I want you to see is, find it here, it's formatted this using a require-like syntax, so you could use something like require.js for loading this in. My constant is now a var, since vars can be read natively in current browsers. And template string is an interesting bit of code there. You'll see that it's actually done the concatenation for me. So this is amazing. It's a multi-line string. Our default text is, and there you'll see it is doing the concatenation. So I was able to write it in this format, but the code I'm getting out is this this ES5 code that will actually run in modern browsers. I am gonna unfortunately have to skip my CodePen example there. So real quickly, I want to highlight just where we're going with JavaScript. The great thing is modules are now a reality. The problem is module loading is not. ES6 does outline what a module format should look like, but it doesn't yet give us a built-in browser native way of loading those modules. That's the unfortunate thing of ES6, I think. We have been using JavaScript loaders for years in the forms of things like require.js or a lot of homegrown solutions. I think you're seeing a big move right now in the industry towards Webpack as a JavaScript loader, and it can play very nicely with ES6 format. Browserify is also quite popular. And you'll see these modules formatted coming out of Babel in a variety of different module formats. My team actually took the approach of going with System.js, which is, I want to talk about just real briefly. System is actually built on top of an ES6 module loader polyfill. It's very small, about 15K, works in IE8, works on the node side. It actually loads ES6 module, but will also load any of those other JavaScript module formats that we've been using for years. And it works flawlessly with another project that's related, which is JSPM. JSPM stands for JavaScript Package Manager. And it's a built-in package manager for System. You can use it with any registry. So it can be NPM or GitHub. They can be basically just any registry, any module that's hosted out somewhere on the web. And where it has a bit of an advantage over just using NPM directly is that it takes care of dependency management for you. So if you have a module that's depending on a certain version of another module, it'll automatically make sure it pulls down the version that you need of that dependency. And it also automatically configures the loader for you. So everything is automatically configured. You don't have to think about it at all. During development, it transpiles in the browser at runtime. So it uses a runtime version of Babel. So you're not waiting for compile times. And then in a production environment, you can actually output the transpiled bundles automatically. So it does that ahead of time. Very easy to use JSPM. You just do a JSPM init to start a project, and then you just say JSPM install from where you want to go get it. So GitHub, and then the account and the repo. And JSPM themselves actually keeps a huge list. I think there's over 800 items on this website of module formatted code that you can use with the simple JSPM command line to install it. And my company actually created our, just to show you how flexible JSPM and System is, we have actually created our own GitHub account called DEG.js, which is a small collection of sort of small JavaScript modules that we can pull in for our projects, and this is publicly accessible, but we can pull into our own projects with just a JSPM install from this account. So just to recap real quickly, preprocessors were great in the time they were around. They saved us from a lot of limitations of our two languages that we used to know and love, and from the brokenness of using them in the browser. The good news is those days are just about behind us. I think CSS and JavaScript are advancing at a pretty lightning pace right now. Because processing is still important, these modular post-processors like PostCSS let us really write this real code again, which is just amazing. It's a great feeling to get back to writing this CSS and this bleeding edge CSS without feeling like we're compromising our browser support. And then on the JavaScript side, these transpilers like Babel and these module loader systems, they really let us write this really succinct, single-purpose, small, clean, reusable code and have it work great in the browser. So if I can summarize it all here, it would just be to say that I think it's time to fall in love with front-end code all over again. That's all I got. So thank you guys for listening. I'll leave the slide up for a minute for anybody who wants to pull down the slides. But I'm ready for questions if anyone has any.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Aaron. Like I said, spot on with the memes and the explanation. Very interesting, and your perspective of Nilla and using processors. As for questions, I think, I think nobody has asked any questions, so that's just perfect. It usually means everything got played out very well. To everyone else, the people that are watching this later on as the day, if you do have any questions, please do feel free to email me. I will be happy to email some of them to Aaron if he ever has the time. He can actually answer them via himself or myself. And
I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. You guys know his Twitter, or you guys can email me, which I will fast forward to him. As always, we always update our YouTube, so we always check for people who ask these questions after. And without further say, I just want to say again, big thank you to Aaron and his group for letting us actually, and that's pretty early for them. So thank you for taking the time out. And to everyone else, thank you for coming. And yeah, man, have an awesome day, ladies and gentlemen. Bye, folks.
Thank you.